Question about your presentation on the power equation. Zach the Jew is asking. See how diverse we are?
Very diverse.
We take questions from actual Jews.
Yeah. Yep.
Who are not white people.
Nope.
I mean, are they?
Well, it depends.
Do they identify as white?
It depends. That's the perfect.
Depends on where they are
That's
that
the
day.
perfect answer too. In Jew terms, it depends.
It depends.
Yep. What do you want me
Everything
to be?
always depends. Okay. So Zach the Jew wants to know about the presentation on power equation. I wanted to clarify for myself the meaning of each variable, mostly the D. That wasn't exactly clear to me. If I understood correctly, D does not equal the actual distance of the jump, i.e. how high I jump, but rather the distance over which the force is produced during the force production event that results in the jump, meaning my contact with the floor as I jump. Is that correct? If it is, that means the distance of the contact of my foot with the floor or the full distance of my body as it moves through the jump from the bottom to the top before my foot leaves the floor. I don't really understand that part of the question, but in terms of the power equation, which is P, power equals force times distance, quantity, right, divided by time, which is the denominator. So the numerator is F, force, how much force you produced, over what distance you produced it. So clearly, you are producing the force over the distance it takes you to produce the concentric knee and hip extension. That distance would be from the bottom of the stretch reflex position, the jumping position we would call it if we were doing a power clean, to the point at which your feet break the floor. Now, how would you measure that distance? Well, you could assign an arbitrary point in the middle of the body, paint a dot on the shirt or something like that, and measure that distance. Point, of course, is that is going to be essentially a constant for each individual, right? That's if you want to measure that, but that is a constant. And the thing about the D in the power equation is that it doesn't do anything to affect really the outcome of the sum of the total power involved in the production. So the critical thing is not D, and we always have said this in our explanation of this. D is an artifact of the test. Okay, like if you're going to measure D for a power clean, what's D? D is going to be the distance from the bar on the floor to the distance, to the point at which you rack it on your shoulder. And for power cleans, that pretty much is the same thing for each rep.
Well, it'd be the same thing. It'd be when your feet leave the ground.
Yeah,
From the D is
from where your feet break the ground and you rack should be essentially simultaneous. So the D is always really a function of what you're testing.
Right. Yep.
Right. The two critical factors are T, which is the denominator. All right. Now, doing the algebra, the smaller the value of the denominator, the larger the value of P. So in a standing vertical jump test, what we are measuring is the time it takes to generate the force that produces the jump. And once again, that is the time spent during the concentric extension of the knees, hips, and ankles. All right, the triple extension, as they call it.
This is why it's confusing, though, because we're essentially saying the same thing. The D and the T are going to be the amount of time / distance that you're pushed. Like if you were standing on a scale, you would measure it by the force that registers on that scale.
Right. If you're on a force plate, the
Yeah,
which is essentially a scale.
it's exactly.
Is-
But what we're actually describing with T is
how
motor,
long
how many
it takes you to
motor unit
call
recruitment.
the motor units into contraction to produce the physical force necessary to accelerate your body's mass to a sufficient velocity as the force production stops, as your feet leave the floor, and therefore the momentum, which is a function of your body's mass and the velocity with which it is traveling when it leaves the floor, that generates the distance that your body moves off the ground.
Yeah, so the output, the final output is separate from the power equation. So in other words, the distance that you jump, like the actual number, 24 inches, 38 inches, whatever that is, that output is separate from the power equation. The power equation is what produces the resulting momentum and all that stuff that gives you the output. So the weight on the bar, the racking of the bar, that's all the output, but that's separate from the power equation. The power equation is how much force can you put into the ground if you're measuring a ground reaction or
In a period
of
in
time.
a very short period
Right.
of time.
So
Right.
so the way I've explained it to like developing coaches is T is your neuromuscular efficiency, D is the test.
Don't worry about D.
Don't worry about D, and then F is your strength. It's your force production, right? So
Yes. And of those three variables, which one is trainable?
exactly,
That's the real question here.
right.
Which one is trainable? The one that is trainable is F. That's how much force you can produce during that very, very short period of time. So, I was going to guess how much time you spent in the concentric phase of that jump. I would say that it's quarter of a second.
Yeah, something like that.
It's certainly not any more than that.
Right.
Now, you can affect the P variable by either reducing T. So if it's a quarter of a second, you could take it down to 0.22 seconds, but probably not.
Because that has other implications.
Because that's genetics.
Right, it has other implications too. How much more force are you going to be able to put in with that shorter
If you
of a
cut
time?
down on the time.
Yeah, because it's always time dependent.
If you cut, yes, in fact, if you cut down on the time, you're probably going to cost yourself velocity.
Right.
Because of the fact that you don't have as much time to recruit the motor units into contraction. But that having been said, the difference in a guy with a 36-inch vertical and a guy with a 22-inch vertical is how many motor units he can get into contraction in that quarter of a second. Yep. A guy with a low vertical jump can only recruit, just to pull out of my ass a number, 25% of his motor units. The guy with a 46-inch vertical, he's calling into contraction 65% of his motor units.
And that's why that test is so good, because it's self-limiting in terms of there's no
Right.
technique.
Technique.
How much
You can't game it.
you can't game, and if you can game it, it's gonna net you such a small output, such a
Right.
small return that it doesn't matter.
Right.
Game
It's
it
a
as much as
test.
you want.
We use the test to determine your genetics. We don't use the test to determine how good you are at passing a test.